Hello, welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have a great warrior for economic freedom, someone who's been working on this for a long time and has been doing a lot of great work across the states, looking at what really drives states to prosper. Is it more government spending or less government spending? More taxes or less taxes? What type of taxes? What about more labor market regulations or less labor market regulations? These are all things that we want to tackle today with none other than Dean Stansel. Dean, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Hi, Vance. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's good to have you on the show, Dean. We've been friends for a number of years now, so it's really good to have you on the program. Before we get started, though, I do want to go over your bio here, read for the audience. I think that'll be a good way to get us started here. Dean Stansel is a research associate professor at the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom at the Southern Methodist University. Before entering academia, Stansel worked for 7 years at the Cato Institute, a public policy research organization in Washington, D.C., where he produced over 60 publications on fiscal policy issues. He is the primary author of the Economic Freedom of North America annual report, which was recently released. We're recording this on November 15th, the day that it was released, which provides an economic freedom index for states and provinces in North America, and sole author of an economic freedom index for U.S. metropolitan areas. Stansel's academic publications have appeared in the Journal of Urban Economics, Public Finance Review, Journal of Housing Research, Cato Journal, and a number of others. He's also been cited or published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Atlanta Journal, Constitution, and more. He's also been in many places across Texas as well, talking about what's going on in the Texas economy. And Stansel earned his PhD and master's in economics from George Mason University and his bachelor's in economics with honors in politics from Wake Forest University. Dean, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Vance.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, it's good to have you on the program. The first thing I like to do with all the audience, the guest, is to ask them what motivates them. What drives you, Dean, to do what you do on a daily basis of looking at economic freedom and trying to find ways to make people better off?
Yeah, well, I consider myself very blessed to have the job I have at the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom, working with folks like Bob Lawson, who you had on recently, and Ryan Murphy, and Mick Zensky, and Rick Alm, and Mike Cox, and I'm probably leaving someone out, but it's I started, as you read, I started in Bridwell College at a think tank, and I really loved working at Cato, especially being a libertarian myself. But also in DC at that age, it's a really fun place to live. I know you lived there recently. Maybe not as fun when you have kids, but when you're in your 20s, there's just so many people like you there. And so, I did that for a while, and I had gotten kind of into the ideas of freedom late in college, and so I just at some point became really motivated by the importance of freedom. And then when I got to Cato, I got assigned to a guy named Steve Moore, who you know, and probably some of us know quite well. And we got, one of the first things I did there is we got started on this project called Fiscal Policy Report Card of the Governors. So at the beginning, I started out with this project where I'm collecting data and comparing states to each other. And I just, something about that clicked with my temperament or something, and I really enjoyed that project. And then we did another one with cities, and that report card was done every 2 years. They're still doing it now. But that kind of led to, I think, my getting involved with the Economic Freedom of North America report about 8 or 9 years ago now. I guess it was. It's been a while, but
Yeah.
But it's just the idea of freedom is really super important. And B, I just enjoy comparing, gathering data, and comparing states to each other, comparing the metro areas to each other. We can get into that later. And so yeah, that's and to be able to do it, I guess, to bring it full circle. So before Bridwell, I worked as a full-time teaching professor at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, and at Eastern New Mexico for a couple of years for grad school. And while I enjoyed that, I enjoy this more. So I'm in a position now where I'm not teaching at all. I have an undergraduate student reading group that I run that gives me the fun part of teaching, right? I sit around with students discussing what we read that week, and then everyone goes home. And I don't have to grade and hear feedback about how I'm such a hard grader and deal with the headaches of students who don't like the way you grade, or creditors that want you to document everything. And that stuff's important. I'm not suggesting that it isn't. But those headaches disappeared, and I'm happy about that. very, very blessed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been great that you've been working on this for so long now, and there's been a lot of good information that you've been able to share, over the years in these reports. And I want to dig into that in a little bit. But what's some of the other, big events that have happened in your life that was it working at Cato, like you mentioned, or other sort of academic situations that really propelled your career to where you're at today? Which, I mean, you've been published a lot now, and now, this Economic Freedom North America has really blossomed. A lot of people use it. I know I use it a lot in my research that I do and in testimony that I would give before hearings. This measure has been really important. But what have you seen has been those stepping stones to get you where you're at?
Well, Vance, I think this is true for you as well. I'm a first-generation college student. Neither of my parents went to college. I have an older brother who went in the Air Force and did 20 plus years and is now enjoying his retirement, plus also working. So enjoying two paychecks. So for me, it was all something new. And again, I'm very blessed that I was able to go to a school like Wake Forest, which back then was pretty cheap, like U.S. News Best Value or something like that. But they've caught up, like all the universities, their tuition has caught up with all the other kind of private selective liberal arts colleges. But it was, of course, the first year was kind of a shock to the system. I thought I was good at math. So Vance, I grew up in a small town. Lived in Miami the first half of my childhood. I'm from Florida, fifth generation native. And around third grade, we moved to a little town about 2 hours north in the interior of the state, a rural area called Arcadia. So we had one high school for the whole county. It was small. There wasn't a lot of opportunity. We didn't even have like AP classes or anything like that. And I graduated third in my class. I was good at math, I thought. And then I get to Wake, and that first semester I take Calc 1 at 8 in the morning, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, with a guy nicknamed Killer Carmichael. And by the third exam, I had locked up. I had ensured that there was no way I was going to get a C. So I stopped going. I took it again the next semester and got an A. Or no, it was A minus, I think. But with a guy nicknamed Easy A May, which it wasn't so much the professor. It was more that it just the second time it clicked. And like I said, I thought I was good at math, but I hadn't been exposed because I didn't have that kind of opportunity in a small town. And that fall, I also took Spanish Lit because I'd had 4 years of high school Spanish, and there was a placement test that was written, and I aced the written placement test, but we hadn't been forced to speak it. So I get in this class with seniors and juniors who were just fluent in Spanish, and the whole class, of course, is taught in Spanish, and I barely got through that thing. It was another example where I just didn't have people giving me good advice because I didn't have people in my life who had gone through this. And so that's where it all started. Somewhere along the way, I was going to be a poli-sci major, Vance. I don't know if your school did this, but our high school in a small town, every graduating class, there'd be this special insert in the weekly newspaper. It was a weekly newspaper. And each student would have a little blurb saying what they want to do. My statement was, I want to be a politician because I like solving problems. Because I thought, well, politicians, they solve problems, right?
Right.
And just view that as you wish. But a couple 7 years didn't take 7 years. A couple months in Washington straightened me out pretty quickly. But I started as a poli-sci major, and then at I think sophomore year, I said, well, I should take some economics, right? This is relevant to my interests, and I just fell in love with it. We used Haney's textbook, which Pete Bedke now is the lead author on, but the economic way of thinking. And this was a micro one semester kind of just for people who are just going to take one semester. So it doesn't count towards the major. I took that, like I said, fell in love with it, and then just double majored. And I had a professor named John Morehouse a couple times who was not explicitly libertarian, but basically classical liberal. And subtly his teaching kind of helped me see the light, and started as an intern at Cato right out of college, making I think $700 a month or something obscenely low. But a lot of his internships were unpaid. So really, again, it was I was blessed to at least have some revenue coming in. But yeah, I just loved the work there and kind of hung around and like I said, got involved with these projects with Steve Moore that I really was passionate about, and I really only left because I had met my wife. She was working there at the time, and the idea of raising kids in she wanted to stay home with the kids, and the idea of raising kids on one salary in the DC area, that just didn't seem feasible with the cost of housing and traffic and crime. So I quit. Went back. I had actually started at George Mason. I first went to Georgetown in a public policy program. Didn't like that at all. Right out of college, just did that part time for half a semester, and then I got good advice from folks at Cato. Said go to George Mason. Their economics program is less heavily emphasizes the math, and it more focuses on economic theory, the economic ideas that you learn as an undergrad. Which it's such a disconnect, Vance. I'm sure you're aware of this, but maybe some of your listeners aren't. If you followed my senior year in college, I went to my advisor. I said, I think I want to do grad school in econ. He said, oh, well, you should have majored in math. And of course, this was following my senior year. It was too late. And they actually had a joint math econ major designed just for that. But again, another example where I wasn't tuned into the idea that you need to reach out and ask people things and seek information. So, but it becomes so much more mathematical at the grad school level, where it's not really what I think of as economics, and I think that's unfortunate. But so I quit my job because I was going to take the PhD, finish up the PhD part-time. I did the first year full-time, but I never got myself out the door to take a class. And there's that clock that's ticking. It's like, oh, wait, you now have to appeal to the dean to keep your credits. And so my wife got a job at Philip Morris down in Richmond, which paid very well, which gave the opportunity for me to say, well, the heck with it, I'm just going to quit. I'll quit my job, go back to school full-time and finish this darn thing off. And that's what I did, and it was it went smoothly from there pretty much. But yeah, I'm glad that we made that change, and I really I enjoyed my 12 years or so teaching full time and being part of an economics department and all that. There's something about that I enjoyed. But when the call came from what was then the O'Neill Center here in Dallas to come join them. And my wife grew up in the area, in the Fort Worth side, and it was a no-brainer. It was a big pay increase and more time to do more responsibility for doing the things that I actually enjoy doing. And so I'm super blessed to be here. And yep.
That is truly a blessing, Dean. Going through all those things, something you have talked about before, but it's the institutional changes. We think about a lot of times in economics, these institutional changes. Douglas North, and Pete Boettke talks a lot about these institutions, and had Boettke on recently, and he talked a lot about all that, right? But it's also in our own lives that we have these institutional changes. Structural breaks is what we might call them in economics, where it kind of sets us on a different path. You and I both were first generation college students. I grew from a very humble background, and then got into economics later after being a rocker for a while, playing in a rock band as a drummer and kind of moving things in a different direction. I never would have thought I'd been doing a podcast, talking about economic freedom and everything else. And yet here we are, doing these things. And it also shows the opportunity that is available in a place like the United States of America, where we have these opportunities to flourish, to overcome maybe wherever we started. We've got equal opportunities, not necessarily the equal outcomes, which is what socialism tries to breed, which ultimately makes it to where everyone's mediocre, because then there's no incentive for people to improve, be more productive in their life and overcome those challenges, because why should I? What's going to be the rewards that we see? And I think that may, bring us into, and we can get back to this later, but I really want to dive into the economic freedom of North America and what you see are some of the building blocks of what works well, what doesn't work well. But maybe before we get there, what exactly is it? What are you measuring? I know some of the audience may be familiar with the economic freedom of the world. That's been out for a while, looking at a number of measures. Like, as you said, Bob Lawson was on recently, and we talked about that in those metrics. Economic freedom of North America is similar, but there are some differences. How would you describe the economic freedom of North America report?
Can I jump on another point first, real quick?
Of course.
You brought up equal opportunity, and and I think that one of the important things about our country is that you do have that class mobility, the ability to, not sort of guarantee, of course, the ability to not be stuck in whatever socioeconomic class your parents were. But
Yeah.
but I would say that I think this is a blind spot for a lot of libertarians and conservatives in that the job isn't done in a sense. There is not equal opportunity in the U.S. If you grow up in South Dallas, for example, for my area, your educational experience is not going to be as good as if you grow up in Highland Park or University Park or the suburbs, Plano. And there's so many ways that we can easily make that more equal. And there's been progress this year in some of the school choice efforts to allow parents to be able to basically vote with their feet and get their kids out of those failing schools. And also then change the incentives for those schools to improve and not just reward failure, but put competition in the system. I always tell my students, look at our university system in the U.S. People come from all over the globe to attend our universities and our colleges. They don't come here for our high schools, right?
No.
And what's the biggest difference between the two? With the colleges and universities, students pick where they go.
Yeah.
With the high schools, they're stuck in whatever the neighborhood school is for the most part, unless of course you have wealthy parents, and then you go to some private school, and that's fine. I don't begrudge those with the means to do so, to escape those schools that are bad. But anyway, I think that's a really important thing that often gets overlooked, the importance of that. But to the
and I think I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I think it's so important for us to have, school choice and competition in the system. I'm hopeful that Texas, we both live in Texas, that we will get some here soon. There's a lot of talk about it this next session. The governor, lieutenant governor, and others have already been talking about it. But if you look at what happened in Arizona with Doug Ducey out there, I mean, universal education savings accounts is kind of the gold standard right now of the next steps. And I'm hopeful that will happen here, because I agree with you, Dean. I mean, education is key. I think if we had a better education system, K through 12, we would have fewer people in prisons, less crime. There's always going to be some bad actors that are going to be out there, but the better educated that you are, the more likely you're going to have a well-paid job. The more likely I think that you're going to be able to be satisfied where you're at and where you work. We spend so much time working is just so important. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's super important. All right, so on to the FNA.
Yes.
So you had Bob on recently. He probably told the story, but the Economic Freedom of the World came about as an effort with Milton Friedman and a bunch of other Nobel Prize winning economists, public policy people. How can we compare the level of freedom across countries of the globe? But especially it was during the Cold War, and there was all this rhetoric coming out of Russia, Soviet Union, how they were cleaning our clocks basically. And but anyway, so it took them 10 years maybe, if I remember right, to figure out how they were going to measure it. And then a couple of years after they got the country report rolling on an annual basis, they started an effort to say, wait a minute, this thing, economic freedom, it varies within countries as well as across countries. And so, especially for Canada, which is the Fraser Institute, Canadian think tank, is the publisher of both of these, really, but they co-publish with other groups. But for them, Alberta was always an outlier, and still is, as being a more economically free province. They call them provinces, and the others, kind of fall behind. So it started as an effort for them to compare, how much better Alberta was, I think, and then but anyhow, so that initiative grew out of the other one, and it's the same basic idea. How do we get the data and organize it in a way that provides kind of a credible measure of the level of freedom or the level of lack of government intervention is sometimes the way to think of it, that we're trying to measure the level of government intervention in the economy. And then a few years, maybe 8 years ago now, not too long after I got involved with the project, we found Fred McMahon, a scholar at Fraser, found a guy down in Mexico, Jose Torra, who literally had to travel the country of Mexico, especially in some of the smaller states, going and hand collecting data, going and digging through file cabinets and stuff. And so after that first year, it got easier for him. But he did yeoman's work to allow us to truly be measuring the economic freedom of North America, because previously it was just U.S. and Canada, which obviously Mexico is part of North America too. So that's where that kind of started, and where it is for now. It's a work in progress, like anything of this nature. You can always that you can always do better. The biggest obstacle is finding comparable data that allows us to compare the states to the provinces, especially, and finding data that's actually reproduced on a continual or a frequent, regular basis, right? So there's a couple of things out there that we could use, but it's like someone did it once and then they didn't do it again. So you have one year of data, which isn't really going to help you with a measure over time. But anyhow,
No. Yeah. And then the big three types of measures that you look at, right, are government spending, right?
Yeah.
And taxes, and then labor market regulation.
Yes. Yeah. So we have three broad areas in the index. The first one is government spending, where we basically take the state and local, the total spending in each state, and divide it into three different categories. So we break the budget into three pieces. But for each of those pieces, to make it comparable across states with different income levels, we're trying to measure, like, what is the burden of this, not per person level, but per, what share of your income is this really consuming? So we take those, divide by personal income, and then we set the most free, or in this case, the lowest spending would get a 10, highest spending would get a 0, and then everyone else is kind of proportionally in between. So you get, in the case of spending, we have three variables, got three scores between 0 and 10, average those to get a spending score. Okay, we do that same thing for revenue or taxes, where we have the three pieces of the revenue pie, and then we add a fourth variable for the income tax rate, because, as you know, the income tax is so destructive to economic growth and economic activity. It's basically a penalty on productive activity. So we get that in there twice to capture the margin, the effect of the top marginal rate. And of course, for Texas, it's 0. So that's great and much in our favor. And I think a big contributor, in part at least, to a lot of the migration out of high tax states like California. So we have those, same process, 0 to 10 for each of the four, and then average them. And then we have three measures of labor market freedom. We look at the minimum wage on an annualized basis, and then again dividing by income for per capita income for the state to make for better comparisons. For example, in a poor state like Mississippi, the federal minimum wage of $7.25 is binding, right? But in a rich state like New Jersey or Connecticut, it's really not. And for the uninitiated, so you've got this supply and demand West Virginia PowerPoint here, where it meets right the equilibrium wage. If the price floor, minimum wage, is put above that, then that's going to create unemployment. It's going to create a situation where more people want to work than employers want to hire. But what I'm saying is that in a rich state, maybe not, right? Maybe that, especially if they still have the federal level of $7.25. Probably no one's actually paying. That's what we call non-binding. So anyway, so we have that variable, which I think is the most important of the three, to see basically how binding is the minimum wage in that state. Of course, a lot of states have higher than the federal now, and that's been a growing trend. And localities now, of course, have gotten into it. And so that's kind of a dynamic, frequently changing measure. Then we look at, to what degree do private sector employers have to compete with the public sector for their workers? So we take the total number of government workers at the state and local level and divide that by employment in the state itself, just to get what share of employment is public sector at state and local level at least. And then finally, we want to capture the impact of union rules in the state, and this is maybe the variable that's most difficult to explain. And the easiest thing is, all right, well, let's just have say, is it a right to work variable? Is there a right to work law or not? But if you think about the way this index works, then you have, on that 1/3 of area 3, everyone's going to get either 0 or 10, right? Because either you have it or you don't. And so, well before I got involved with this project, it was decided that taking what they call union density, so the number of union employees in the state of all kinds, private, public, whatever, divided by the number of employees as a whole. So what percentage of the workforce is unionized? And that is a proxy for, to what degree do union rules create barriers between employers and employees. And it's not to say that unions should are a bad thing per se, right? People ought to have the right to freely associate as they wish. But anyways, that's the third variable. And same process, 0 to 10, average them, and then average those three area scores. And it's it doesn't change a lot from year to year, but over time, you can see changes that reflect policy changes when states lower their income taxes. North Carolina's done that lately, and they're up into the top 10 this year.
Yeah.
Things like that definitely are captured by the index, and it's been used in a ton of research to find that states with higher economic freedom tend to have better outcomes of all sorts.
Yeah, better outcomes with GDP per capita, personal income. There's a lot of variables that are measuring basically prosperity. They're at least correlated, right?
Yeah, and it goes beyond just what you think of off the top of your head: income growth, poverty, things like that. But to all sorts of other, especially the country index is older, but especially with that one, people have gotten into all sorts of things: corruption, pollution, childhood mortality, all sorts of things that you can, all sorts of ways you can take it and still make a contribution to the literature. Because it's a funny thing that hasn't been studied yet, but it's getting pretty wide net is out there.
No, yeah, that's great. It's great. And I think too, some of this has some economic assumptions that go into it, like we do with most of our models and indices and everything else. And part of it, I guess, is that the more government spending that you have, the less free that you're going to be. I guess right. to some, let's say that we were a Keynesian person, they might push back, right, and say, well, that's not the case because you need these roles for government. You've got to have government spending money. So how is that reducing people's economic freedom if they are the ones that are providing property rights and other things that are helping out people in the economy? What do you say to something about like that?
Well, they're just wrong.
Yeah.
kidding. No.
All right, Don, cut it off.
They have a different view of than I do. In my view, anytime government takes from you taxes, sure, taxes are voluntary in theory, but try not paying them. Right?
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah.
And so to me, that's an infringement on your freedom. And so for sure, you could get into a heated debate even amongst kind of libertarians as to, well, we need government to do this. We're going to have it to do the military, right? We couldn't have a private military. I mean, I would argue that we don't need it for anything. That anarchy as a concept could work through private voluntary relationships with each other. Now, the thing is, as kind of a thought exercise or an argument over beers is one thing, but of course it becomes irrelevant because how the hell are you going to get there from where we are now, right? You can't go from here to all of a sudden blow the whole thing up. And so I'm very sympathetic to my anarcho-capitalist friends' views. I just don't think that in terms of other than arguing with each other, there's really a whole lot we can do with that. I think we need to try to, as much as possible, move in the direction of more freedom and hope for the best. But the system is not designed to really make this easy. And I'm not super optimistic.
And Dean, I mean, I think going down that route a little bit is that, Milton Friedman said, the ultimate burden of government is not by how much it taxes, but by how much it spends, right? And so spending is really that ultimate burden. And this is the reason why, like in my research, I work so much on spending limits and trying to restrain the growth of government spending, because if you don't spend it, then you don't need to tax, right? Like,
Right.
So you come up with different things the government's going to do first. Those are the demands by the people, by the voters and everything else. They decide on what types of government that they want to impose on people. Then they need bureaucrats. They need someone to run it and fund it, whether it's national defense or something else. And so, i.e., that's going to create a reason for government spending. And then you need to find a way to fund it most efficiently. So taxes are kind of like the secondary to government spending in that sense. It's kind of, but in some sense, I guess it could be like the chicken versus the egg, which comes first. But I think in some sense, it is government spending that really drives the burden of government in our lives, which is one reason why I think it's so important to have it in your measure.
Yeah, for sure. And it's different for states than for countries in the sense that, especially here in the U.S., I mean, the federal government basically has a credit card with no credit limit. And it seems there must be some tangible limit up there somewhere. But so that they're not really limited by how much they can bring in revenue to what they can spend. They should be, of course, in my view, but that's another podcast. But at the states, as you know, it's different at the states because most, I believe it's 49. You might know the number on this.
Yeah,
Is it
49.
that have a
I think
balanced budget
Vermont's the only one that doesn't have a balanced budget amendment.
Yeah, they're ranked 44th, I think, 45th, something like that.
Okay. See?
But the point is that yes, so there's that tension between the two, which is why in the country level thing, whereas revenue and spending are not separated into different areas for the states, it matters because number one, because they have to balance their budget, but more importantly, because some states get more kind of proportionally in terms of federal aid than other states.
Yeah.
So if you're bringing in money collected from across the whole country, well, then that's a little less burdensome for the taxpayers in that state. And so all that stuff kind of in the mix requires us to kind of separate these out and look at them separately. But yeah, for sure, the notion of limits, spending limits, is something I looked at many years ago when I was at Cato. I sense there haven't been a lot of new ones passed, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Or I remember Tabor in Colorado was a big one, but that's got to be 20 years ago now, right? So.
Oh yeah, that one's been around for a while. Texas did pass a stronger one this last year in 2021.
That's
based on population and inflation. I have been working on that for a number of years and testifying on it for several sessions, and they finally got it passed. So we'll see how that one goes. But you're right, there needs to be a lot more done across the country. When you're looking at these overall numbers, and I'm looking at the report now, and I'll make sure to put this in the show notes page so everybody has access to it. And it's at FrazierInstitute.org. You can find it there.
Hey, send them to freetheworld.com. Freetheworld.com takes you directly to the interactive website with the map, and you can get the country stuff there as well.
Perfect. Yeah, freetheworld.com. Okay, good. So I'll put all that in the show notes page as well. And it's broken down, Dean. I know you brought this up to me on the differences, but for the audience, there's the all government level, kind of the figure 1.1 that kind of breaks it down for all of them. And then there's the summary of the ratings of U.S. states and Puerto Rico for economic freedom at the subnational level. Both of them are important for different reasons, but what's kind of your distinction between the two? And the second one, of course, is just for the United States on figure 1.2b. But what do you see as the differences there?
So the first one, the all government level, is the one that's most important for the publisher, Fraser Institute, because it allows the Canadians to compare their provinces to U.S. states. One of the problems that it creates for the U.S. audience is that when you pull in the federal data, as we talked about just a minute ago, some states, are basically net taxpayers in the sense that they get less in federal spending in their state than their residents pay in taxes, and vice versa. So there's a whole lot of moving parts in there that when you add in that federal piece, you get some strange things. Like look at the figure 1.1. The tied for fourth most free is South Carolina. And if you look at the subnational index, it just looks at the state and local. They're 24th. So there's a handful of states where it makes a bigger difference, and you get kind of weird outcomes like that with states looking really good that maybe aren't quite so free if you're just comparing them to other states. And I think Montana's another one. It's up there at 6th, but it's 18th in the other one. Anyhow, for my work, and even if you look at what academic researchers use, like it or not, most people in America don't care about Canada. So the subnational index allows them to ignore Canada, pretend it's not there, and just focus on the old USA. But more, I think it is a more accurate measure of the relative level of freedom across the states in the U.S. And so that's the one that I use in my work and that I emphasize in sort of, discussions out there in the world about it. And that's the one on which New York and California are 50th and 49th again. Florida's first, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Texas, and Tennessee are tied for fourth. So that to me is the one that matters. And that distinction of you look at our four most populous states. I mean, it couldn't be more contrasted in terms of their economic policy approach, with Texas and Florida up at the top, and New York and California literally at the very bottom.
Yeah. What? Yeah.
And it matters. You see the migration out of those states that's headed south and east.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's great. And thank you for that overview, Dean. Yeah, because I was looking, because Florida, it's been New Hampshire has been number one the last couple of years, right?
New Hampshire is typically right up there at the top, if not first, at least second. So that was they were first last year, so there was a slight difference there.
Yep. And you and I have been working on this for a long time. You have the Economic Freedom North America Conference there at SMU and everything else. And, I'm always excited when the new report comes out. And when I saw this report, something that kind of stood out to me, and the audience should know as well, is this is the 2022 report, but it's for 2020. It's always a couple years of data. So this is the first report that's come out since the pandemic, since shutdowns and everything else that happened like that. But even in that, it's only a few months. It's what, 4 months? Right. It's the fiscal years that are in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So two things: that we rely on the U.S. Census Bureau for their fiscal data that they collect from the state and local governments, and there's always a 2-year lag on that. I think it comes out early in 2022. The 2020 data came out, so there's that. And yes, it's important to understand that almost every state has a fiscal year that ends at the end of June. COVID started mid-March, so you've got all of June, all of May, all of April, and part of not even 4 months worth of COVID-related changes that are being only indirectly captured by what we do here. We don't have a measure here that looks at COVID restrictions. We have fiscal data and we have the labor market freedom stuff, and so surely all of that spending that occurred, the federal government spending, some of that filtered down to state and local. In the state and local index, some of that will be in there. But again, only in this year's report, only a couple months worth of it. And despite the fact that we don't have a direct measure, and it was only like a third of a year, the overall on the all governments index, it includes the federal stuff, the average score declined from 8.03 to 7.9, and that brings it down to the lowest point. It had been kind of gradually rising, the lowest point since 2009, right during the Great Recession. And it's the biggest drop since that year as well, 2009. So I expect next year we'll see a larger decline because it'll capture a full 12 months worth. And so anyway, it's similar to what they saw at the country level. It was a big drop in 2020, and no big surprise there, I suppose.
Yeah. When I was talking to Bob Lawson, because the Economic Freedom of the World in the United States went back to the lowest score since 1975. I mean, it's a huge drop overall. But he kind of made the similar point, though, that 2020, the next one using 2021 data could be even worse, given what's happened. There may be some updates along the way as well. But I think this is why it's so important to look at these data is that, look, even if you have a situation where there is shutdowns that are going on in places like Florida, Texas, where we were shut down almost for a full year, if you think about the restrictions that were in place and everything else. But the government spending part of it didn't increase dramatically. There were other ways. So always relatively speaking, Texas, Florida, New Hampshire, some of these other states that are up here near the top continue to remain at the top. It wasn't like they were going to fall off because some of those things that took place. Whereas those states that are usually more big government in a lot of other ways, they stayed near the bottom. Would that be a good way to help explain some of that?
Yeah, for sure. And one thing to keep in mind is that for the fiscal data, which makes up a big portion of what we do, not only did we had increased spending, but on the revenue side, we had declines in tax revenue. And for both of them, the denominator, personal income, also declined quite a bit. So there's a lot going on there, a lot of moving parts again. And you mentioned revisions. I do want to highlight that.
Sure.
Each year, the previous year's data, the Census Bureau releases a revised version of the previous year's data. So looking back at 2019 scores in this year's report. In other words, the year before the most recent ones, New Hampshire wasn't first last year, although they were in last year's report. They were actually fourth. So
Wow.
Florida was first last year as well, based on that revised data. And given all that went on during COVID, I would expect that there's going to be some revisions, probably larger than normal revisions, and those are going to go both directions. So it's a net wash, probably overall. But for some states, you might see a bigger move than normal, just based on the fact that the data wasn't complete when they submitted it this time a year ago or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good, Dean. And one of the things that I like to look at with the report is, I know whenever I was testifying before Ways and Means Committee here in Texas, I've used this report quite a bit to say, look, here's how Texas ranks compared to the other states. Because one thing that legislators like to hear is how their state compares with other states, right? how are we doing? Yeah, right. And so they're looking at these things. And of course, in Texas, we always want to be number one. We want to be top. And so even if we're ranked fourth in this index, it's like, okay, well, why? I'm also doing a lot of good work with the Pelican Institute in Louisiana. Louisiana ranks 20th. They actually improved a little bit, I think, from 23rd in the previous report to 20th. But one of the things that's interesting right now, Dean, is that a lot of states are moving to this flat tax revolution of flat in personal income taxes. And I'm thinking that that's going to have a positive effect on these measures and the economic freedom of North America moving forward, because that's a big part of it. As you mentioned earlier, personal income taxes disincentivize people to work. They disincentivize people to live there, so they move, and that creates economic effects, dynamic effects overall as well. Whereas those states, those no income tax states, no personal income tax, Texas being one, Florida being one, Tennessee being another. I mean, a lot of them are the top ones of your overall measure. The ones with the highest income tax rates, California, New York, Hawaii, some of those other ones are near the bottom. But even some of the states, there are now 14 states that will soon have a flat tax after 4 of them have done it so far this year. But even if you look at the first 9, the last 5 that have been added, those flat tax states, even the no income tax states, still do better in terms of GDP growth, migration, and job creation. I've been looking at this recently, so it's kind of fresh on my mind. And so in my view, we should be finding ways to get rid of income taxes altogether. Flat taxes are nice, but no income tax would be even better. And I guess that would report better on the economic freedom of North America. But then the question is, where do you get the money from and things of that nature? But where do you see, where are some policy indicators from the research you've been doing? I know you're not necessarily a policy guy, Dean, but just from the economic and the data that you've seen, where should states be moving to in order to increase economic freedom and have more prosperity?
Yeah, so there are 2 that jump out to me. Well, one is the minimum wage, and here it's trying to stem the tide of all these huge increases in the minimum wage. It was a long time ago, but in 1987, the New York Times editorial page, their editors, not some op-ed writer, put out the headline that the correct minimum wage is 0. And a lot of time has passed and things have changed, so you wouldn't see that in the New York Times now. But I would agree with them that the minimum wage is a poorly targeted policy that, while it may be intended to help low-skilled workers, and it does help some of them, it also hurts a lot of them who are shut out of the market because they're priced out of the market. But anyhow, I think that's an area that I'm not very optimistic that there'll be change. The one where I think there's more optimism is kind of the one you were talking about, is the income taxes. I was just looking at the current income tax rates. California's top rate is 13.3%. So if you are not that they're the only people that matter, but if you're a business decision maker, a CEO of a company, right, someone who has a pretty high income, a lot of your income's going into that in theory, into that top bracket for some of them. And so for you to say, all right, I'm going to move my headquarters from San Francisco to Austin, that's a huge chunk of savings tax-wise and housing-wise, right, in terms of the housing costs of San Francisco compared to Austin. I know Austin's housing prices are out of control, but it's nothing compared, right, to Northern California. And so,
right.
So yeah, I think voters can more easily wrap their head around, we need to lower income tax rates than we need to get rid of the minimum wage. I think we, as economic educators, have failed to convince people that the minimum wage is
Yeah.
as bad as it is. And I don't know, it's
Yeah.
the 30-second soundbite in favor of the
Yeah.
minimum wage is so much easier to make than the one explaining why.
Yeah.
creates this,
Well, I mean, it's even shorter than that. Dean, you must hate poor people.
right,
Period.
precisely.
Right.
Yeah, that's
which isn't the case. It's actually that I hate people being poor, because you're essentially forcing people to be poor with the minimum wage. The real minimum wage, as we know, as you mentioned, is always $0, because if you don't have a job, if you can't get your foot in the door to move up the income ladder, your wage is going to be zero.
Well, and so much of it goes to people who are, say, high school students or college students of reasonably wealthy families working a part-time job just to make some spending money. They don't need this, boost from a minimum wage that applies to everyone. Something like the earned income tax credit is a much more targeted way to try to help those who really are in need of assistance. There's plenty that are like that, but the minimum wage just is too much of a blunt instrument to be as useful as something like the earned income tax credit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I mean, overall, look, I think there's a lot more we could dive into with the Economic Freedom North America. I hope that the viewers will go and look at the show notes page, go to Free the World. Is that what you said?
Freetheworld.com. Yep.
Free the World. Yeah, freetheworld.com. And there's a dog in the background, just in case the audience is wondering what that is.
It's trash day, so trash trucks.
It's all good. Yeah. Yeah. But I think there's so much good things to look at. I mean, you also will go through and say, hey, here's how economic freedom in the top quartile, middle quartile, two middle quartiles, and the bottom quartile, how that compares with different measures of economic data and things of that nature, I think is really helpful for the viewer to see, hey, this isn't just about economic freedom. This is really about people. It's about improving people's lives. It kind of goes full circle again, Dean, to what we were discussing earlier is, many people may start off from humble beginnings, but they have the opportunity to succeed. Some maybe have different opportunities, as we discussed. But if we have more economic freedom, and economic freedom in terms of spending, taxes, and labor market regulations are important, but a lot of that underlying, those are more macro, underlying a lot of that is going to be school choice, right? Or schools. Education comes from government spending. What the influences are on the business tax climate from the tax system that's in place are going to have microeconomic effects. And then labor, whether or not you're able to get a job, are going to influence your future. One of the big things that I've also looked at over time is occupational licensing. I mean, that is one that hits the poor the hardest and keeps people down throughout the process. And so I really appreciate all the work that you, Dean, and that you do, Dean, here on this for Index and continue to do it over time to let people prosper. What would be kind of what are your last remarks for the audience about this, or anything else you'd like to discuss before we close?
I mean, I think, Vance, that it's just to me, it's about awareness of the importance of freedom and how big a difference it can make in the standard of living of people, not only here in the U.S., like Texas compared to California, but globally as well, right? I mean, the developing world where the income differences are huge, not just, relatively small for us and across the states. And so yeah, I think raising awareness of the importance of public policy and getting people to understand why it matters that we have good, solid economic policy and policy of all sorts to kind of help people be freer, because when you're freer, you're more able to prosper. I think that's your the title of your podcast makes it the point very very clearly and succinctly.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Dean, for all the work you're doing and for being on the podcast today. And for our audience, please go and rate us as 5 stars. We love that, and subscribe to Let People Prosper Show wherever you get it and wherever you listen to. You can also find it at vancegan.substack.com. That's where all the show notes will be. Thank you, Dean, for being on the show, and for everyone for listening. Let people prosper.